Their economies are deeply woven together through factories, pipelines, highways, and supply chains that cross the border every single day. Trucks loaded with auto parts, food, machinery, and fuel move back and forth thousands of times daily, quietly sustaining what is widely considered the largest bilateral trade relationship on Earth. By 2020, total trade in goods and services between the two countries reached roughly 700 to 800 billion US dollars annually. This is not a symbolic partnership. It is a practical one that touches energy prices, manufacturing jobs, food costs, and even electricity flowing into American homes. Yet despite this integration, tensions have escalated again. With renewed tariffs and political pressure under President Donald Trump's 225 trade policies, a familiar question has returned with urgency. When trade conflicts arise between the United States and Canada, who really holds the power? To understand the balance, it is important to look beyond headlines and examine structure. The United States economy is nearly 10 times larger than Canada's in total output. That difference alone shapes negotiations. While both countries benefit from trade, they do not rely on it in the same way. Canada's economy is far more exposed to disruptions, not because of weakness, but because of geography and scale. Modern trade relations between the two countries took shape with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, NAFTA, eliminated most tariffs and encouraged companies to build supply chains that treated the border as a logistical step rather than a barrier. In 2020, NAFTA was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. While the New Deal preserved most of the original framework, it also reflected a shift in power. The United States pushed successfully for greater access to Canada's dairy market and stricter rules of origin for automobiles, demonstrating how leverage works when market size is unequal. Trade disputes, however, did not disappear. Softwood lumber, dairy quotas, steel, and aluminum have repeatedly triggered friction. What changed in 2025 was intensity. The Trump administration imposed broad tariffs, ranging roughly from 25 to 35% on selected Canadian goods, citing border security concerns, drugs, immigration pressures, and what it described as unfair trade balances. Canada responded with counter-tariffs on American exports, including steel products, alcohol, and consumer goods, escalating the conflict into a full-scale trade standoff. The numbers reveal the core imbalance. In 2024, Canada exported roughly $450 billion in goods to the United States, while importing around $350 billion. This left Canada with a goods trade surplus of about $45 billion. On the surface, that surplus might suggest leverage, but trade power does not come from surplus alone. It comes from dependency. Roughly 70 to 75% of all Canadian exports are destined for the United States. In some years, the share has been even higher. By contrast, only about 14 to 18% of U.S. exports go to Canada. For the United States, Canada is an important partner. For Canada, the United States is the partner. This asymmetry means that when trade flows are disrupted, the shock reaches Canada faster and cuts deeper. Economists at institutions like the Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada have repeatedly noted that exports represent a much larger share of Canada's GDP than they do for the United States. Canada's economy depends on trade for roughly 60 to 70% of its output, while the U.S. economy relies far less on exports as a share of GDP. This difference explains why tariffs, even when applied symmetrically, do not feel symmetrical. Still, Canada is not without leverage. The relationship is not simply large, it is deeply integrated at the sector level. Energy is the most powerful example. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, exporting oil worth well over $100 billion per year. Refineries in the Midwest are specifically designed for Canadian heavy crude, making substitution difficult and costly in the short term. In addition to oil, Canadian hydroelectric power supplies electricity to several U.S. states, particularly in the Northeast. Autos represent another critical link. Cars assembled in North America are not built in one country from start to finish. Components cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a vehicle is completed. A single auto part may travel back and forth 5 to 7 times during production. Tariffs disrupt this system quickly, raising costs for manufacturers and consumers on both sides. Beyond energy and autos, Canada exports minerals, lumber, fertilizers, and metals essential to U.S. industry. The United States, in turn, supplies Canada with machinery, electronics, aircraft components, and consumer goods. This interdependence means that while Canada is more vulnerable overall, it can apply pressure in targeted ways. The 2025 tariff escalation demonstrated this dynamic. As tariffs took effect, Canadian exporters began diverting shipments to Europe and Asia where possible, though not always efficiently. Some industries reported that up to a quarter of exports were temporarily redirected, often at lower margins. Meanwhile, American exporters faced unsold inventories in Canada, particularly in sectors targeted by counter-tariffs. Prices rose on both sides of the border, and uncertainty spread through cross-border business communities. Tourism and small businesses were also affected. Border regions such as Michigan, New York, and Ontario felt the impact first. These areas depend heavily on cross-border commerce, and local political pressure increased as job losses and higher costs became visible. This is one of Canada's quieter sources of leverage. U.S. border states feel trade pain disproportionately and often lobby Washington to de-escalate. When analysts assess power in this relationship, they usually separate structural leverage from tactical leverage. Structurally, the United States holds the advantage. Its economy is larger, more diversified, and better able to absorb prolonged trade disruption. The U.S. can withstand higher costs for longer periods without systemic damage. This reality shapes negotiations, even when not explicitly stated. Canada's leverage is tactical. Energy supply, critical minerals, and supply chain choke points allow Canada to inflict concentrated pain. A serious disruption to Canadian oil or electricity exports would immediately affect U.S. fuel prices and energy security. However, using this leverage aggressively would also harm Canada's own economy, limiting how far it can go without self-damage. As trade experts often note, mutual dependence creates restraint. Complete decoupling is not realistic. The costs would be too high for both sides. This is why, historically, trade wars between the two countries tend to end in negotiated settlements rather than lasting separation. By 2025, the pattern remained consistent. The United States used tariffs to apply pressure and extract concessions, relying on its market size as leverage. Canada responded strategically, targeting politically sensitive sectors while signaling willingness to negotiate. Neither side could fully win without harming itself. In practical terms, the United States holds more power in a prolonged conflict, but Canada is far from powerless. The real balance lies in mutual vulnerability. Cooperation generates growth and stability. Conflict raises costs, disrupts industries, and fuels uncertainty. As one senior trade analyst from TD Economics summarized in earlier disputes, trade wars between deeply integrated partners tend to function less like battles and more like self-inflicted injuries. The lesson of US-Canada trade history is not domination, but interdependence. In the end, power in this relationship does not belong entirely to one side. It rests in the ability to endure pain, apply pressure selectively, and ultimately choose negotiation over escalation. And in 25, as in decades before, the real winners will be those who understand that cooperation remains far more profitable than conflict.